The careless mash you in the face rock and roll.
Do any of you still drink?
Nope.
So you
For over 40 years, Mick Mars was the quiet force driving Mötley Crüe's explosive sound. His riffs defined the chaos, his discipline anchored the madness, and his presence gave the band its edge. But behind the walls of stadiums filled with screaming fans, Mick wasn't just fighting one war. He was fighting two. One against a brutal disease that slowly fused his spine and tried to steal his body away, and another against the very bandmates he thought were his brothers. This is the untold story of betrayal, greed, and survival in one of rock's most dysfunctional families. How could the quietest member of Mötley Crüe end up in the loudest war of all? And how did a man who was told he'd be in a wheelchair by 30 fight back against both disease and betrayal to leave behind the loudest legacy of them all? Robert Allen Deal, the man the world would later know as Mick Mars, was born on May 4, 1951, in Terre Haute, Indiana. His childhood was unstable from the start. His family moved constantly, first to Huntington, then to Garden Grove, California. Every new school meant new faces, new attempts to fit in, and more disappointment when it didn't work. For a young boy, life felt rootless, unsettled, and lonely. But one moment would plant a seed of destiny. At just 3 years old, Robert watched a country singer named Skeeter Bond perform at a local fair. Dressed in a bright orange suit covered in rhinestones, wearing a massive cowboy hat, Bond looked larger than life. That vision struck something deep. I'm doing that, Mick later remembered. That's what I want to do. But childhood dreams would soon collide with a nightmare. By age 14, Robert began feeling sharp, burning pain at the base of his spine. It was unlike anything he'd ever known, like fireworks exploding inside his bones. His family didn't have the money for doctors, so he tried to endure it. The pain spread upward through his hips and spine, until even simple movements became agonizing. Sometimes he couldn't stand without screaming. For more than a decade, Robert lived with this mysterious torment without answers. He worked odd jobs, formed garage bands, and kept chasing music, even as his body betrayed him. At 27, after years of suffering, he finally got a diagnosis: ankylosing spondylitis, a rare, incurable disease that fuses the spine into solid bone. The doctor told him he'd likely be in a wheelchair by 30. But Robert refused to accept that fate. He didn't want pity, he wanted music. The disease was locking his spine, twisting his posture, and shortening his height by 3 inches. But his hands still worked. His fingers could still play guitar, and that meant his dream wasn't dead. By the late 1970s, Robert knew he needed a reinvention. In Los Angeles, image was everything, and Robert Deal didn't sound like a rock star, so he took a new name, Mick Mars. The surname was short, sharp, and powerful, perfect for someone ready to conquer the rock world. In 1981, he placed a classified ad in The Recycler, a Los Angeles music paper. It read, "Loud, rude, aggressive guitarist available." The ad caught the eye of a hungry young bassist named Nikki Sixx, who had just formed a new band with drummer Tommy Lee. They needed a guitarist. They needed Mick. When Mick met Nikki and Tommy, they were barely out of their teens, wild, reckless, and full of ambition. Soon they recruited singer Vince Neil, and the lineup was complete. From the start, Mick stood apart. While the others were living the Sunset Strip lifestyle, parties, girls, drugs, Mick was older, quieter, and more disciplined. He didn't touch heroin and warned his bandmates never to go near it. He did drink heavily to dull his constant pain, but when it came to music, he was focused, professional, a lifeline of stability. Most importantly, his guitar tone became the backbone of their sound. Heavy yet melodic, raw yet precise, it gave Mötley Crüe the dangerous edge they needed. Even in their earliest rehearsals, it was obvious. This wasn't just another glam metal band. Mick Mars's guitar made them different. In 1981, Mötley Crüe released their debut album, Too Fast for Love. It was raw, energetic, and bursting with attitude. Mick's guitar sliced through every track, giving the music muscle and melody in equal measure. But it was their second album, Shout at the Devil, in 1983 that catapulted them into the stratosphere. The record went quadruple platinum, fueled by Mick's razor-sharp riffs on songs like Looks That Kill and the title track. On stage, fire and explosions surrounded them, but it was Mick's sound that gave the chaos structure. Fans saw the glory. The screaming arenas, the MTV videos, the sold-out tours. What they didn't see was Mick fighting through searing back pain night after night. His disease was progressing, fusing his spine tighter, making even basic movement agonizing. But he never let it stop him. Instead, he adapted. He developed unique playing techniques to accommodate his limitations, creating a style no one else could replicate. By the mid-1980s, Mötley Crüe were rock gods. Albums like Theater of Pain and Girls sold millions, and their tours were some of the most excessive in rock history. Drugs, scandals, near-death experiences, everything about the band screamed chaos. Yet through it all, Mick remained the anchor. While his bandmates spun out of control, he kept showing up, guitar in hand, ready to play. But behind the fame, cracks were already forming. In Mick's 2023 lawsuit, a shocking claim came to light. His bandmates had been trying to replace him as early as 1987, right at the peak of their success. Why would they want to push out the man who helped define their sound? The reasons, according to the lawsuit, were brutal. First, Mick was older, 10 years older than the rest. In an image-driven business, he didn't fit the wild, youthful look. Second, his disease was becoming visible. He moved stiffly on stage, his spine fusing tighter each year. To some, he didn't look rock and roll enough. But the biggest motive was money. As a founding member, Mick owned 25% of everything: albums, merchandise, tours, even the brand name. If they could replace him with a hired gun, his share could be split among the remaining 3. That meant millions more in their pockets. The campaign to push him out began subtly: gaslighting, criticizing his playing, dismissing his ideas, making him feel like a burden. At the same time, Mick turned to prescription painkillers to manage the agony of his disease. The addiction gave his bandmates even more ammunition to undermine him. To the world, Mötley Crüe were unstoppable. Inside, betrayal was brewing. By the 1990s, Mick's health and addiction nearly destroyed him. At one point, Nikki Sixx described finding him looking like an old, frail man, maybe 90 pounds, with gray skin and a beard to his chest. To his bandmates, Mick looked finished. Instead of rallying around him, they pushed him aside. In the studio, session players were brought in to record his parts. On albums like Generation Swine and New Tattoo, much of Mick's work was erased or replaced. John Corabi, who briefly fronted the band in the 1990s, later said bluntly, "They had no respect for Mick. To them, he was just the grumpy old bastard." But Mick wasn't done. Against all odds, he survived his addiction, underwent hip replacement surgery, and fought his way back. His body was weaker, but his resolve was stronger. He returned to the stage, playing with renewed energy. Fans cheered his comeback. But behind the curtain, tension with his bandmates only deepened. By the 2010s, Mick had been enduring the disease for 5 decades. His spine was nearly fused solid, his neck muscles struggling to hold his head upright. Yet he kept performing. In 2015, Mötley Crüe launched what they called their final tour, even signing legal documents saying they'd never tour again. Publicly, Nikki Sixx and Vince Neil pointed to Mick's health as one reason for retirement. Mick was furious. "Once again, any rumors about me quitting because of my health are BS," he tweeted. "When I'm done, you'll hear it from me." But the narrative stuck. In 2019, the band announced a reunion with Def Leppard, blowing up their own farewell promise. The payday was too massive to resist. Their stadium tour in 2022 was projected to make over $100 million. Mick, now in his 70s, pushed himself to endure 36 stadium shows, performing night after night in excruciating pain. Unbeknownst to him, his bandmates were preparing their next move. They gathered crew statements, accusing Mick of forgetting parts and suffering memory issues. They were quietly building a case to declare him unfit, even as he delivered flawless performances on stage. In October 2022, Mick announced he was retiring from touring due to his condition. But he made it clear, he wasn't leaving the band. He still wanted to record, write, and play select shows. The next day, the band blindsided him. In their own statement, they declared Mick was out of Mötley Crüe entirely and announced John 5 as his permanent replacement. Then came the severance deal. After 41 years, they wanted to slash his share from 25% to 5%, then to 0. They asked him to sign away his ownership of the brand he had helped build. Mick refused, and that's when the smear campaign began. Rumors of cognitive decline, accusations he couldn't remember songs, gaslighting from the very people he had carried through overdoses, scandals, and chaos. In 2023, Mick struck back. He filed a lawsuit revealing decades of betrayal. Even more shocking, he claimed his bandmates were using backing tracks and lip-syncing on stage, accusations that shook the foundation of their credibility. The quietest member of Mötley Crüe had finally declared war. The courtroom battles exposed everything his bandmates tried to hide. A Los Angeles judge ruled in Mick's favor, ordering Mötley Crüe to hand over the financial documents they had refused to share. The ruling confirmed what fans suspected. This fight wasn't about health. It was about money. The numbers were staggering. Their 2022 stadium tour grossed over $170 million. Mick's 25% stake should have been worth over $40 million. No wonder they wanted him out. Meanwhile, fans reeled from the lip-syncing allegations. The band that had once thrived on danger and authenticity now faced accusations of fakery. For many, it wasn't just a betrayal of Mick. It was a betrayal of the fans themselves. But Mick wasn't done. In 2024, he released his first solo album, The Other Side of Mars. The record wasn't just music. It was defiance. Heavy, inventive, and raw, it proved Mick's mind was sharp, his creativity intact, his passion unbroken. Songs like Loyal to the Lie cut like open wounds, channeling decades of deception into blistering riffs. At 73, with his body fused by disease, Mick Mars had done the one thing his bandmates never expected. He stood tall, alone, and louder than ever. In the end, Mick Mars's story is about contrast. His disease, the very thing that should have broken him, made him fight harder. His bandmates, blessed with health, wasted theirs in indulgence and greed. Mick gave them loyalty for 4 decades. They gave him betrayal. He carried them through chaos, and they tried to erase him. But instead of disappearing, Mick secured his legacy. Not just in Mötley Crüe, but in survival, resilience, and the music he continues to make on his own. Sometimes the loudest legacy isn't built on scandal, drugs, or fame. Sometimes it's built on quiet strength, relentless defiance, and the refusal to be erased. Mick Mars may have been the quietest member of Mötley Crüe, but in the end, he left the loudest legacy of them all.